The paired comparison analysis does something slightly different from a lot of other methods in that it pitches decisions directly against each other. So when you're making a decision about something or picking a direction, you take your options and instead of evaluating each on its own merits, you actually evaluate it against all the others. And what this does is it does stimulate great discussion, which, as you may have noticed by now, is a big part of what I think is very important in decision making, is that brainstorming element that you can bring to it. So what does this mean? In a paired comparison, as mentioned, you take all your multiple options and you lay them out, make sure that you have a list, a comprehensive list of all the different options available to you. And what you're doing is you're comparing these directly against one another. So you are saying these two options, if they do battle, who wins? And you make sure that you're doing that for each option against each of the others. And there is a quantitative element to that. So you're putting a score against each victory, if you will. So option A versus option B, which option wins and by how much. What you come out with at the end is an actual number that determines what the best option is. So let's see this in practice. This ends up looking something like this. You get a table and both your rows and your columns are the same thing. In other words, all of your options. So option A, option B, option C. In this case, I'm pitching 3 options against each other. You might have more than that, and that's fine. And for simplicity's sake in this table, I would encourage you to nominate A, B, and C, or one simple designation against each one, because you're going to have to fill those in the table. And as you'll notice, some of the boxes in this table are grayed out, or in this case, beiged out, because you can't pitch option A against option A. And you will be pitching option A against option B in the first row, so you don't do that again in the second. So your table, if you have multiple options, it looks like an expanded version of this table. You don't fill in every single box, just the relevant ones. And then what you do is you start to say, option A versus option B, fight it out. Which one do I think comes out the winner and by how much? So I'm using a scale of 0 to 3 in this case. I suggest 0 to 3, maximum go to 5, but you really don't want too broad a scale. And determining that A, in this case, I pitched against option B, wins, but just by a little bit, by 1. Option A against option C wins by a lot. It wins by 3, by far the better choice. And then I've pitched B against C, and in that case, option C wins by a significant but not absolute margin, so by 2. Now, before I do my total calculation, let me explain. I don't have any zeros in here, but when I said using a scale, I did say 0 to 3 because if I pitch option A against option B and they are complete equals, I put a 0 in that box. Neither option gets a point there. Neither one should be weighed higher than the other. So that's why you keep the 0 in there. If neither one comes out an obvious winner, it's a 0. Once you're done, you tally up your total. So I've just done it across in the rows here. Option A has 1 point against option B, has 3 points against option C for a total of 4 points. Option B has 2 points against option C and 0 points against option A for a total of 2 points, and C obviously has 0 points total. So my obvious winner here is option A. You can also do this by percentage. In a table like this, the maximum you can have is 6, and so 4 is 66% of that. A lot of people end up doing this in percentages. If you have a lot of different options, then percentage is probably an easier way to view it. But if not, you can do it by numbers. Numbers works in either case. Now, you are tackling both qualitative and quantitative because when you're pitching these against each other, then you are having a discussion, and that is your qualitative analysis. And then, of course, the quantitative is in the numbers that show up in the table. What does this mean in the context of our framework? Well, our framework does examine each option in isolation. So what I like about the paired comparison analysis is that you can start here. You can do this as your starting point. So in the pre-gaming of this course, we talked about listing all of your options, and you always have a minimum of 3 depending on what the decision is, but generally you have a minimum of 3 because you have to choose between 2 things and you also have the status quo. I encourage you to always find a minimum of 3 options. It should never be 2, so at least 3. And then you can pitch those 3 against each other here, and then take that front runner and take it through the framework to really examine in detail that particular option, and does it actually give you all the outcomes that you hope? You could also incorporate the framework analysis into each of these in order to do those comparisons. That's much more extensive labor, but will also give you that full picture. So that is also an option. So use the paired comparison to first, I would say to first examine your options against each other, and then take your front runner or front runners and do the detailed framework just against those winners.